evening. My name is Mfundo Mabalani. Welcome to ANN7's ANC Decide 2017 show. The show brings you a build-up to the much-anticipated ANC elective conference. Our 4 news crews will be crisscrossing the country, visiting thousands of ANC branches. We'll keep you updated on burning issues at branch level and how the race is shaping up. We'll also touch base with each candidate as they hit the campaign trail, garnering for those votes. A panel of experts will unpack delegates' choices who stand a better chance to win. Broadcast times are 5 p.m. every weekday evening and repeats at 7:30 a.m. the next day. Catch us on Twitter at ANN7TV and Facebook, or stream live on ANN7.com. Now it's all systems go for the ANC race to succeed President Jacob Zuma. Let's take a look at what is at stake in the presidential race.
Wemfoga tambo awulale ngoxolo Obudala uzabalaza Obudala uzabalaza uzabalaza.
The ANC presidential race has begun in earnest in the year of Ora Tambo. 7 candidates are campaigning with the values of Ora Tambo as their guiding principles. The 54th ANC elective conference is billed as a turning point for the 105-year-old movement. It is the first time since 1952 that there are so many candidates raising their hands to be elected as president. Radical economic transformation, clean governance, inclusive growth, organizational renewal. These are some of the subjects that will determine the ANC's and the country's trajectory at the conference. Each candidate has chosen one or several of these subjects as a rallying point. The one single point that will ultimately decide the race is economic transformation.
This economy, it requires a strong ANC. It requires a visionary leadership. It requires a united alliance. It requires a population that is completely united, moving together with their movement, with their leadership, going forward to grow the economy of South Africa.
We cannot continue to have a South Africa that is rich in all sorts of minerals, that is rich in all sorts of natural resources, that has a huge population, but its people, the majority of its people, are poor.
Amid differences about economic reform is the threat of an ANC split like the one seen in Polokwane in 2007. Hence, some in the ANC propose a compromise candidate to unite the warring factions.
So as we go to this conference, we must deepen unity. We have said to comrade, these factions need to be dismantled. We were part of going to Polokwane. Those days when we were going to Polokwane, I tell comrades that we were very angry. We were so angry that we came to a point where we didn't realize that in our anger we're destroying the organization.
The battle for the soul of the ANC is down to the wire. Candidates are going all out to be elected at the Watershed Conference. It now rests with the branches to decide who best represents their aspirations. Bureau Report, ANN7.
Now joining us in studio, political analyst Professor Sipho Siepe and Kim Hela, and Professor Begim Gomez-Zulu is joining us from Cape Town. Now, to our panel, good afternoon to all of you. Now, some say there's much turbulence ahead of this elective conference. You know, one thing we can say, or at least doomsayers say that perhaps the ANC is going to split. But what we do know for a fact is that it's unprecedented to have 7 candidates vying for that top spot. Professor, just to start with you, what does this really mean? Does it mean there's such a crisis in the ANC that many are raising their hands up to say, I would like to lead going forward? Or have people become more ambitious, which is something that the ANC has discouraged for a very long time?
Well, I think it's probably a crisis is caused by our poor conceptualization of a democratic environment. What is happening in the ANC was something that was historically inevitable, in the sense that the ANC has come in as part of the broad church. But as democracy begins to be consolidated, people begin to start wanting to pursue their own ideological interests. So when you have that, you have these unresolved contradictions that existed under apartheid. So some people would then tell you that the ANC has always been united, but they don't tell you that there was a unifying force or a glue that kept them together. Now that the glue is gone, there should be a the organization needs to reinvent itself. So it can talk about the celebration of a broad church, but if the broad church does not address the internal contradictions, then you're going to have what you have. So I'd see this not as a crisis, but as an opportunity for the ANC to start the reinvent itself.
Let's try and get in Professor Begum Gomez-Zulu in Cape Town. Professor, what do you make of this unprecedented 7 candidates vying for that top position? What is your position on this? Is it over-ambition, or really there is a crisis that necessitates many to raise their hands?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, your listeners. It's a combination of factors. I share the sentiments made by Professor Siepe that we are dealing with an ANC which is different from the one you had in the 1950s, 1960s, for example. So right now, the context is quite different. First of all, we have a number of people who have joined the ANC after 1994. So those are the people who joined the ANC with a different vision, a different mission, a different agenda from those who joined the ANC before then. And then there are people who see the ANC as a way of moving up the social ladder, so to speak. And they realize that if they want to do that outside of the ANC, it becomes difficult, if not impossible. And then as a result of that, then you'll find people joining the ANC not necessarily because they want to liberate the masses, as Professor Siepe correctly mentioned, that initially that was the idea. So people are joining the ANC for different reasons, some of which have nothing to do with the electorate, have nothing to do with the black majority, have nothing to do with the country, but have everything to do with them. So they do some of the things for nothing else but political expediency.
Now, Kim, perhaps to bring it to you, he says out of the 7, he's not quite sure who could possibly lead. But at the center of all of this is perhaps ideology, that we've got 7 candidates, but many are not so sure what exactly they're offering. Is it a case of we're going with whichever vehicle is moving, we're going to join this group, but it's not necessarily for what once was for the ANC, where the character or what they stood for was to liberate. But now it's the proximity or access to power and resources that seems to drive others to want to lead. What is your position on that?
Well, I'm going to take a far more optimistic stance on this leadership battle. This year, we celebrate one of the most exemplary leaders that the ANC has ever produced, Oliver Tambo. And I'm hoping that the 7 candidates are in their own ways motivated and inspired by this leader, and have therefore come to the fore to lead the ANC at a very critical point. I think you're quite correct to say this is a fight for economic freedom, and I think the leader who is able to deliver on that without compromise and with radical maneuver is going to be the winner on this. But what we're going to see in December is democracy at work as the ANC branches appoint not only the leadership of the party, but the leadership that is going to take South Africa forward in 2019 and beyond. And I like your comment on ideology. I think we must remember the very important P word, which is policy. And I think the candidate that adheres to the policy of the ANC, particularly with regard to radical economic transformation, will fare best. And they must do this with conviction. They need to also show policy implementation, which I think has been slightly weak in the ANC. So I would like to see an acceleration of policy implementation, particularly on RET, which can be not put on hold for any longer.
That remains the very contentious one. But panel, let's quickly now cross over to my colleague Abigail to look at Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma's strength and weaknesses first.
Well, let's take a look at Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, some of her strengths and weaknesses. One strength, vast experience in the liberation movement and the government as well. A weakness perceived to be linked to her former husband, the current president, President Jacob Zuma. Taking a further look at strengths and weaknesses, one of the longest-serving democratic government ministers is one of her strengths. A weakness, long public service record, often perceived as lack of fresh or new ideas. Further strength and weaknesses, credited with overhauling inefficient Home Affairs Department. A weakness, accused of inaction on the delayed rollout of HIV and AIDS treatments. These are some strengths and weaknesses. A further look, first woman to be appointed as chairperson of the African Union. A weakness, questions often raised about her 5-year tenure at the African Union.
Now, Professor, just to start with you, taking a look at those strengths and weaknesses. Firstly, when we talk about Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, she seems to have the backing of the structure. She's got the ANC Youth League, the Women's League, the MKMVA. So, with that said, do you think that she stands perhaps a better chance?
Yeah, actually, the people must understand that when voting happens, it will be happening within the ANC. It will not be happening in the media. It will not be happening in the polls. It will not be happening in the radio stations. It will be members of the ANC who are going to be voting. And these are the structures have already taken a position on the matter.
Professor Begi, your take, strength and weaknesses here. And it's said that perhaps her strength is the radical economic transformation. What's your take?
I agree absolutely, because there is something that we are not doing as a country, and I think that we saw this thing happening at the ANC policy conference. This politics of denialism will not take this country forward. There are people who are saying that economic transformation has no race, which is totally incorrect. I think I will recall that when Neshitenze was making a statement, he indicated that this economic transformation is not just a South African issue. And then he went on to say, however, we cannot say ours is, in fact, a white monopoly capital, and therefore a radical economic transformation will have a racial element. And I tend to disagree with him on that one, because as much as we agree that economic transformation is in fact not only a South African issue, ours is specific, for the simple reason that the politics of this country is not like the politics of the rest of the continent in many respects, one of which being the fact that with dual colonialism, South Africa was supposed to be the first country to be free in 1910, but freedom was given to the wrong people, which is why we only got our liberation in 1994. So therefore, I think I agree with the fact that when you look at a person like Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, what she is doing, she is being firm but fair, to say that the reality on the ground tells us that the country has made inroads in terms of political progress. However, economically, black people, the black majority, are still out there. And you cannot change that situation if you are apologetic. So we need someone like her who is going to articulate the policies of the ANC and be firm but fair at the same time.
Oh, there you have it. He says firm but fair. Kim, what do you make of that? Would you say that we need to add that element of race when we're talking about radical economic transformation, to say we cannot be denialists and say that the race element is not there, that perhaps the white minority have actually benefited and they still hold most of the wealth?
Completely. I don't think we can even argue that point. And I think one of my criticisms of the ANC in the past has been its timidity in dealing with white business and white monopoly capital. And I think that she is the candidate that may just be the perfect antidote to that and deal convincingly with the dominance of whites, both in key economic sectors and in terms of ownership of land, of stolen land, we may add. And just a general comment on Dr. Dlamini-Zuma. I think she's a woman and a politician of great substance, and I think she's a very worthy candidate. What I like with her approach is that her campaign, in my view, is miles ahead of any of the other candidates, because she has articulated very clearly on RET, very clearly on land return, and more recently on free education. And these are the key touch points in our society at the moment. So I must commend her on that. If I may just say what I'd like to see a little bit more of from her, is an ability to, or an opportunity to connect with the youth a little bit more. I would like to see her spending more time with understanding the issues and the realities in the youth, because the longevity of the ANC is going to depend on ensuring the confidence of this youth.
Now, panel, let's now cross over to my colleague Abigail again to look at Cyril Ramaphosa's strengths and weaknesses.
Let's take a look now at Cyril Ramaphosa, some strengths and weaknesses. Extensive experience in trade unions, business and government as well. A weakness, perceived to have pursued business interests over public service. A further look here, another strength, Deputy President serves as the leader of government business. A weakness in this regard, blamed for not helping solve the current administration's problems. A further look, another strength, credited with negotiating SA transition and drafting of the Constitution. A weakness, accused of not using negotiation skills to avoid the Marikana massacre. A further look at strengths and weaknesses. One of black economic empowerment pioneers in big business is a strength. A weakness, on the other hand, perceived as pro-business due to his own involvement in business as well. This is a look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of Cyril Ramaphosa.
Now, Professor Begi, maybe we could start with you on this one. COSATU, SACP and SANCO have endorsed Ramaphosa. Now, the pertinent question is, do these structures really have any significant influence since they don't really have voting rights?
They do have an influence when it comes to political rhetoric and mobilizing the forces out there. But come December, their voice will be insignificant. So it goes back to the point that was made by Professor Siepe that we mustn't be deceived by a lot of noise we hear from the public and hope that when it comes to crunch time, those noises will count. We saw this happening with the vote of no confidence against the president, when the impression created was that there are enough numbers to take the president out of office. But when it came to voting, those numbers amounted to nothing. We might have realized also in 2016, when we had the local government election, when the EFF was filling stadiums, and then, of course, people were of the impression that the party was going to take a number of municipalities. They never got even a single one. So the reality of the matter is, the noise that we hear is not, in fact, translatable to the reality on the ground. So then, as much as COSATU is making those statements and endorsing the deputy president, as much as the SACP is doing that, when it comes to voting in December, I don't think those articulations will count. So basically, I don't take them seriously, honestly speaking, because then the branches will send delegates, and those delegates will go there with a clear mandate as to who to vote for. So, honestly speaking, I'm not convinced.
All right. Professor, he's not convinced. He's saying at the end of the day, it's about the branches. They're the ones that have the final say. But you've got the likes of SACP, like he says. When they mobilize, they could cause that confusion, or at least they could sway votes to be on this side. So what's your position?
Well, I think the SACP has made its position much clearer. And the more clearer it gets, the more irrelevant it becomes, because they are beginning to define themselves outside the ANC. And as time goes on, people will say, why should we take these people seriously? And one must also know that for as long as people are within the ANC alliance, they carry a lot of weight. Once they are moving out, they're moved out, or they walked out, their influence becomes less. You saw that happening with Holomisa. When he was still in the ANC, he was a people's general. You saw that happening with people like Tera Lukota, who was a chairperson. You saw that happening with people like Vavi within the alliance. Right now, people don't talk. So once you move out of the alliance and out of the ANC, your value gets diminished. But most importantly, with regard to Cyril Ramaphosa, I hear people talking about success at BE and all that. But really, if you think about the BE, that cannot be called success when you are co-opted into other people's businesses. And most of these people who have been successful because the people who control the economy knew that they had to comply. So what they did was to select the black people who are compliant. If you take the case of Marikana as a good example, you just have to go there and see the condition of squalor that black people live in. And yet you had in the board somebody who was a former trade union leader. So you ask what happened to this political consciousness and the radicalism and militancy that we saw once the person gets into the board. It disappeared. And we could not stop the Marikana, although I've said in the past that he can't be blamed for that. But the subsequent to that, the stances that he has taken on a number of issues actually leaves much to be desired.
Pass over to my colleague again, Abigail, to look at Zweli Mkhize's strengths and weaknesses.
Taking a look now at Mr. Zweli Mkhize, some strengths, extensive experience in liberation movement and the government as well. A weakness, work in the ANC underground structures are not widely known to everyone. A strength, served ANC in many capacities, including the Treasurer General position as well. A weakness, limited exposure to ANC delegates due to behind-the-scenes role. Another strength with regards to Mr. Zweli Mkhize, turned KZN economy around as finance MEC and the Premier. A weakness, ambiguous stance on issues like radical economic transformation. Taking a look at a further strength, crossover appeal between ANC traditionalists and reformists, and a weakness here perceived as a compromise between two dominant ANC schools of thoughts. That's a look at Mr. Zweli Mkhize.
Now, perhaps, Kim, we can start with you, the man that's considered or branded himself as the unifier. How much support base do you think he really has?
Well, I think as both professors have said, the branches are going to be king in December. And I think he's got a reasonable level of support. And I think he should have a reasonable level of support because he's a leader, he's a very astute political leader. He's got a solid grasp of policy, which is important. And I do believe he's an implementer. However, I do worry that his campaign and his positioning of himself as a compromise candidate may actually compromise him as we get closer to December, because it gives a sense of him being in the middle, and we don't need the middle now. We need radical maneuver, as I've said several times in the program so far, and whether he's able to position himself as the leader that can deliver economic freedom in this country is a question that we need to ask ourselves, and the delegates at the ANC conference need to ask themselves.
Interesting point that she makes, that it could be to his detriment being the unifier or somebody that's willing to take a bit from this side and a bit from that side. Could it be really to his detriment?
Yeah, well, I think it could be a unifier within the ANC. But what we need is not so much peace within the ANC. What we need is we need somebody who can take a position. And I do think that this notion of people sitting on the fence, you're not going to get anywhere by sitting on the fence. And what we must also understand, and this seems to be the major failure in this country, is to understand that when you talk about transformation, you are talking about changing the status quo. And when you change the status quo, you should also understand that there are people who are beneficiaries of the status quo. So there'll be people who are unhappy. As we speak now, it is very clear which people are unhappy about which candidates, because they know that with this candidate there's a possibility of change. So the sooner we get this notion, we abuse ourselves with the notion to think you can change and everybody's happy. It's not going to work, it's nonsense. So Zweli can, yes, play the role that he has played of trying to unify, but what we need is also a leader who takes a position. Great leaders, the Mandelas, the Bikos, Malcolm X, all of them, they are great because they took positions. They are not wishy-washy people like some of the politicians of today.
Let's now cross to my colleague Abigail again to look at Lindiwe Sisulu's strengths and weaknesses.
Next, let's move on to Lindiwe Sisulu, taking a look at some strengths and weaknesses. A strength, vast experience in liberation movement and the government as well. A weakness, work in the ANC underground structures not widely known to everyone. A further look at some strengths, one of the longest-serving Democrat government ministers. A weakness in this regard, questions being raised about her tenure as Human Settlements Minister. Another strength in regard to Lindiwe Sisulu is born into and associated with the ANC's prominent families. But weakness is perceived to be basing presidential campaign on that great family name. A further look at some strengths and weaknesses, crossover appeal between ANC traditionalists and reformists. A weakness, campaigning on gender ticket questioned by the ANC Women's League. This is a look at Lindiwe Sisulu.
And now Kim Lindiwe Sisulu, you know, she's one lady that has said it's a must that the ANC at this time looks at a woman to lead the ruling party. But she hasn't gotten the support of the ANC Women's League. So how much of a chance does she have?
I don't think that she has much of a chance for this top position. And I think so far her campaign, in my view, has been unimaginative, and it has been too focused on anti-Zuma rhetoric rather than on issues. I haven't seen her articulate anything on policy. I haven't heard her stance on radical economic transformation. So I suggest if she carries on this campaign, that she does so on the basis of solid policy articulation and implementation. I also do not think that the ANC must be a party of entitlement. And I think the heritage of her family, as much as we all appreciate that in this country, I think she must not count on that. She needs to show herself as an individual, talented politician, which I think she is. But she must rely on that and not count on the legacy of her family to push her into any position. That would not be fair.
Interesting. Peggy, to rope you in, your take on Lindiwe Sisulu's campaign thus far?
I share the sentiment of my colleague. In fact, the issue of bringing in family history will be a disadvantage. We will recall that when then President Thabo Mbeki was about to be elected as president of the party and then president of the country, Uomkov, that is his father, Govan Mbeki, was asked the question, this is your son and we want to give him a position, what is your view? And he was frank. He told them, he is my son, but he's not ready to rule. But then the ANC went ahead and then gave him the position. So if Lindiwe Sisulu then were to use the family history and say, this is the ticket to power, then obviously that will be a disaster.
But there are three other candidates in the race, Baleka Mbete, Jeff Radebe, as well as Matthews Phosa. Perhaps, Kim, you can enlighten us on this one. Do they really stand much of a chance if we have to talk about these three?
Well, I have a feeling that perhaps these three may not see the last lap of this race. And if I can be slightly disrespectful, which I don't want to be, I think someone like Phosa should withdraw from the race. I think he's run his race.
Okay.
And I don't see him mounting a campaign with any vigor. I'm not sure what he still has to offer right now, so I think he should take a back seat as a
And
veteran.
then the other two?
Well, I think Radebe is possibly a little bit underestimated. I mean, he is the master of strategy and the master of policy, and I think that bodes well for the position in the leadership of the ANC, of course. But I'm not sure that he has built up enough momentum around his campaign. With Baleka, a brilliant woman, I'm not sure she has the appetite for the top slot.
At least she's saying that she's somebody that's willing. So what happens there? Because many are saying this is the time for a woman to lead, and she's a woman.
Certainly. And I think she's a strong woman. I think she's independent. She's an excellent thinker. Let's come back and look at this after December. I've got a feeling she's going to pull out. We'll see if I'm right.
Professor Begi, Kim says she might pull out, at least when we're talking about Baleka Mbete. What's your take?
Yeah, in fact, I don't think that, I think Baleka Mbete has served this country, and then it's time that she gives others a chance, because the opposition parties play on her emotions. You have seen this several times when the EFF and the DA would take her to task, and then she would lose temper. And then when that happens, she will then at one point say to Malema, I'm talking to you as a parent. And then Malema would say, this is not a mother-child relationship. We're all honorable members. And then you could see that she has lost temper. So basically, I don't think that she's a strong candidate. And also, for the same point I made with Lindiwe Sisulu, she was there when the ANC Women's League came up with the name of Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. So that in itself raises questions, why now? And then, of course, I don't think she should be a strong candidate. With Matthew Phosa, Luckily, I was talking to some colleagues before coming here. I was saying that if I were his advisor, I would tell him to pull out now before he embarrasses himself, because I don't think he will make it at all. The other ones, of course, they can try their luck, although for me the race is just between Cyril Ramaphosa and Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma.
Thank you very much for joining us. Kim Hiller, thank you as well for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
And that's all we have for you this evening on ANN7's ANC Decide 2017 show.